everyone to the first event in our Peace and Relationship series. My name is Shireen Khosrowpour. I'm a psychology professor at ACC. I'm also director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And it's from the center that we bring you this Peace and Relationship series, along with a bunch of other really cool stuff. Layla will put in the link to our website where you can find all of the other events and join us for as many as you want. All of these events are open to the entire world because we are on Zoom again this semester. So spread the word and join us for these things. They'll also be recorded, as Layla mentioned, and they will reside on our website with links, YouTube channel, right? Yeah. Okay, I don't want to say too much myself. I want to briefly introduce David, our speaker today, and then turn it over to him, and he'll say more about himself. So David Cooley started his work in restorative justice circles, and then he used and applied some of those same principles and adapted them to working with people dealing in conflicts in their interpersonal relationships. So that's why he's here with us today. And I'm just going to stop talking and turn it over to him. Thank you for joining us, David.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen, and thank you for everyone that's here. So my name is David Cooley, and I've created a model called the Restorative Relationship Conversation model. As Shireen said, that's based out of my experience in restorative justice. I want to dive into all that in the course of this presentation. I've got a slideshow that'll help unpack that information. Before we do that, though, I'd just like to say a little bit about my educational background, my road to getting where I am. It was sort of a long, distorted journey. Like, it wasn't a clear trajectory from where I am now to where I started. I grew up with two parents who were very, very ardent supporters of social justice. They were both social workers in the 60s and 70s, and then actually became Presbyterian ministers, but always kept that lean towards social justice. So that was something that was really internalized from a very early age in my house. And it was something that started to emerge later on. I ended up graduating from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, with a religious studies degree and an emphasis on Eastern philosophy and religions. But within that trajectory, I ended up going to several different schools, having several different majors, and did 3 years at community college, which was really a fundamental experience for me. There was just a different commitment to the education. There was less of the kind of classic academic ego that can sometimes manifest in universities. There's just an approachability to my teachers, professors, and other students that I really found refreshing. So it's really cool to be here with you all who are connected to this really awesome program in the context of the Austin Community College. So I'm really stoked to be here for that. Before we get started, as Shireen said, we are being recorded, but I would like to invite people, if they'd like, to just say their names and where they're from, where they're joining us, and just kind of a one-line summation of why you're participating or listening to this presentation. It'll give me a sense of who's in the audience and who I'm talking to, and then even for people who watch this afterwards, after it's been recorded, kind of what is the community? Because that's a big value of mine, is to expand the community of people who are doing this work, who are interested in conflict resolution and transformation. So again, because we're being recorded, I know everyone's not comfortable with that. If you are, go ahead and speak up. If not, then we'll move forward. But I just wanted to give the chance to anyone that wanted to do that to do so. Awesome. Carol, go for it.
Hi all, my name is Carol Iruegas. I am a student at ACC in my first year. I'm in the Network Administration of Associative Applied Science program. And I try to participate in a lot of student events and general events at school, so I feel like it helps with my commitment to it. And that's all I have to say.
Nice, thank you. I appreciate you sharing. Good to meet you.
My name is Enrique Parada. I'm a staff member here at ACC in the Computer Science and Information Technology Department. I have an interest in conflict resolution, in both in a personal and a professional aspect. I think that learning skills are always beneficial instead of always, as my nature is more reactive. So I think that having new knowledge is always helpful.
I like that. Appreciate that honesty. Thank you, Enrique. And we got some people chiming in the chat. Awesome. Mediation. Oh, deep interest in restorative justice. Ruth. Hello, Bailey. Working on core credits. Awesome. Anyone else?
I'm Rosa Maria. My daughter Lydian is in the Peace and Conflict department. She's a student, and she told me about this workshop, and I am a nurse, and I really like conflict resolution.
Awesome. I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Looks like Jared's hand is up.
Yeah, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me, and I hope it's not too echoey because of where I am. My name is Jared. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Government at ACC, and I also used to be a teacher at an alternative school in the area. So, you know, restorative justice and circle conversations aren't new to me, but I'm always learning, and I was really excited to see this opportunity pop up. But I still think that it really applies to not just building healthy relationships and having good conflict in general, but I also have a lot of discussions in my classes, and sometimes because of the politically charged nature of the course, things can get a little bit dicey. And so just, yeah, looking forward to conversing with you all.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love Dicey. We're inviting Dicey in today. All right. Sarah teaches at Humanities, background community safety. Awesome.
We also have another hand from Daryl.
Thank you, Layla. Daryl, please.
I appreciate that. I'm also an academic advisor here at Austin Community College, as Susanna just mentioned, and just always trying to find ways in which I can be proactive and looking at, you know, having students understand the importance of wholeness, well-being, and things of that nature. So if they do come across a situation that may be dealing with some sort of conflict, they can have those tools to kind of, you know, react in a more positive way and kind of have that kind of help them kind of be situated in that.
Awesome. That's great. I love that. And what we are going to do today is really focus on the nuts and bolts of the process that I offer so that it feels hopefully practical to everyone. I am going to get started now, but I appreciate everyone who chimed in for chiming in, sort of luring you into the conversation initially, break the ice, because the way that I like to present is to make it very interactive. So I want to invite anyone that wants to make a comment, ask a question while I'm presenting to just raise a virtual hand. Layla will acknowledge your hand and then just chime in, just throw it into the ring. I think it makes for a more dynamic experience, definitely for me. And sometimes those questions can be the key to unlocking sort of the understanding for other people that are participating. So I always welcome it. There will be some time at the end for questions. And my hope is that we can sort of dive deeper into a dialogue, but everything that everyone said so far feels right on target. I think you're in the right place, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this material with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to launch into the presentation. Let's see, just have to find where this. Give me a moment. My presentation's disappeared. There it is. All right. Try one more thing. All right. Can everyone see that? Fantastic. As I said, my name is David Cooley, or has been said by two people now. The model that I offer is restorative relationship conversations. What are restorative relationship conversations? They are, So Layla, I'm not sure why, but my screen just stopped responding to the commands.
Maybe unshare.
All right, let's see what happens. Sorry about that, y'all.
And then we can try resharing.
Okay.
It might be that you
There it
need.
is. There it goes.
Perfect.
That was it. Awesome. All right. So restorative relationship conversations are guided conversations that address interpersonal conflict and transform it into greater intimacy. Again, we will jump into the nuts and bolts of that in just a few moments, but I want to do sort of a philosophical inquiry into conflict itself. Specifically, what do people think about when the word conflict arises? Typically, what I find is that people go into sort of some version of this, avoidant or sort of collapsed, closed in, something that's scary, or they respond with sort of an explosive, defensive, attacking posture, kind of the classic flight or fight responses, which is unfortunate. Neither of them seem to really help us when we are in the moments of conflict. So what do we need? We need a new way to see it, right? So that conflict no longer becomes something that's scary or terrifying, but instead becomes really an invitation to deeper intimacy. That can feel sort of like an easy thing to say and a harder thing to sort of enact, but it is possible. Part of what we need to do is change our default response to conflict, right? What is our typical response? Let's say a partner or a friend or a family member comes to us and says, I didn't like what you said, did, or how you acted. What is our typical sort of response to that? Do we clam up, or do we sort of get defensive? One of those fight or flight responses that I mentioned. What I'd love to do is to be part of generating a culture that has a different response, default response to conflict, one that's based on curiosity. So when someone says to me, I didn't like that, I want to be able to say, tell me more. You've got something important to tell me, and I'm grateful that you're honoring our relationship by bringing this to me instead of just attacking or holding a grudge or letting some negative feeling become toxic over time. So we really want to be able to respond spontaneously with curiosity. Part of doing that means we have to change how our conflict feels in our very nervous systems. Literally, how does it feel in your body when you're approached with what feels like could potentially be conflict or a challenging situation, right? Instead of feeling inherently scary or hurtful or problematic or traumatic in the case of some people, how can we actually sort of condition our nervous system to be open, willing to receive people in a new way, right? The interesting thing about curiosity is we can't be curious about something that feels like a threat. So we have to change the way our nervous system feels in the face of conflict in order to stay curious. And this can take an act of not only consistent practice over time, but also this kind of reframe that I'm suggesting here in our paradigm about what is conflict, what's its inherent nature, what can it teach us, and how can we respond to it. So before jumping into the model itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about my journey of how I've got to creating the restorative relationship conversation model. And as noted before, it started in the realm of restorative justice. Now, restorative justice is a growing practice. It's got about 60 odd years of track record. Started in the late 50s to 60s and has ballooned into sort of a larger field of restorative practices that can include different modalities, all underneath the concept of restorative approach. And so you'll see these things in schools, courts, businesses, and even governmental institutions. Specifically, what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is an alternative to the traditional criminal justice system. It's an attempt to humanize it right? Many of us have the awareness that the system that we currently have in place for dealing with crime is not essentially effective in the sense of rehabilitation or repairing damaged relationships or hurts in the community. And so restorative justice has come up with an alternative way to dealing with crime and the subsequent sort of punishment that comes in isolation that comes along with that as a consequence of it. So on the left, we've got the classic punitive response. You know, what is the criminal justice answer to crime? What is its value system? In a nutshell, it focuses on rules and determining guilt. This is also rules that have been established by the state. These are not typically rules or sort of guidelines that the community itself is small local level, but more at a larger level. So there's can tend to be sort of a dehumanizing element to it. The imposition of sanctions when crimes are committed, when these laws have been broken. Sanctions is just another word for punishments. And in those punishments, the consequence is typically that people are separated, right, removed from the community in sort of an attempt to rehabilitate. And yet I think there's sufficient statistics now to suggest that removing people from their communities does not actually enhance rehabilitation. On the other side, we've got the restorative response, right, which is an emphasis on harms and determining needs. In particular, the harms and ruptures that happen between human beings, individuals, communities, relationships is really what the focus of restorative response is. In that sense, it's a very humanizing response to crime. It affords everyone the opportunity to be participants in the process of making amends, of repairing harm. In sort of the classic legal structure that we have, often the people who have been harmed by crime don't actually have the opportunity to participate in the way that things sort of play out. They're not able as stakeholders, valuable stakeholders, to have their voice heard in the judicial process, which I think weakens its ability to sort of create more intimacy and stronger relational bonds. Finally, it seeks not to separate someone from their community, but to rebuild trust and social support. How do we re-strengthen a damaged social network after it's been compromised through sort of wrongdoing? What does restorative justice look like? It looks very much like this. It's people sitting in a circle. Usually there's one, often more than one facilitator, trained, either professional or volunteer. And they're the people who have been harmed by an incident and the people who are responsible for that harm, all sitting together, talking about what their experiences of the situation was, and then figuring out what needs to be done to make it right. How do we make agreements? What does everyone need to repair that harm? Some organizations will use the language or the nomenclature of victim and perpetrator or victim and wrongdoer. The organization that I worked with in Colorado changed that lexicon in a way that I think was more empowering for participants, from sort of crime doer or criminal or wrongdoer to responsible person, right? The person responsible for taking acknowledgement or accountability for their actions, and the harmed party. So this is something that I just want to throw in there as sort of a paradigm shift in language. 4 of the big takeaways from working in restorative justice for me were: 1, the power of structure to create safety. You know, people are stepping into these restorative circles and there's a lot of charged emotion, right? You're often facing strangers whom you've committed an act of aggression against. What's keeping people safe when triggers or emotions could be really activated? Your nervous system's on high alert. And what I saw was it was the structure, having the process, a well-worn process to guide people through their conversation, is what ultimately created safety for people in the long run. And that really stuck with me. 2 is acknowledgement. Often the turning point in restorative conversations or restorative justice processes was the moment when acknowledgement was delivered in a sincere way. Someone who'd been hurt, having the direct acknowledgement from someone who really saw it, reflected that harm back, and then acknowledged the impact of their actions on the other person. That was often sort of the linchpin to undoing the knot of tension between them. So in some ways, it feels like acknowledgement could be considered sort of something, a universal human need in the face of conflict. It looks like I just lost control again. It may be when someone is entering into the process that I lose control. So I'm gonna do this. Okay, great. The third aspect, making agreements. People need to know that things are going to be different. There needs to be some kind of contract between people to show that not only has there been acknowledgement, but there's sort of a path forward on making things different or repairing the harm that has been done. And then finally, trauma awareness. This is one of the biggest things, and this is especially important for practitioners, right? When you are working with potential victims or harmed parties of crimes, there needs to be a special understanding of the intricacies of the way that trauma can play into people's responses in a restorative process. This is often true with couples as well, or family members. You know, what is a person's trauma history? How do you address it? Sometimes trauma manifests in the course of a conversation with someone, and it's helpful to have some tools in how to create space for that trauma instead of plowing through it or pretending like it's not happening. Sometimes we have to slow down a process and really address trauma in a way that allows it, gives it a certain level of safety, and then really open that space for new kinds of learning and integration. So trauma awareness is a really huge piece of this puzzle that informs the work that I do now. So after years of doing restorative justice, I started to want to try more modalities. I wanted to do it on a different level. I didn't want to be tied to the institutions. So far, I personally haven't found anyone who's applied the restorative approach to intimate relationship conflicts. My interest in doing so was what initially gave birth to the restorative relationship conversation model. I do work with lots of different configurations of relationships, friends, business partners, family, and intimate or romantic partnerships. And it's been really fulfilling. It's a much more personal process for me, which I find very enriching and deepening. And it's different than a therapeutic approach, right? This is a process-oriented modality as opposed to sort of a talk therapy approach. And so a lot of people find a lot of merit in it, which is part of the novelty of bringing it to a context like intimate relationships. So what do we need to transform personal conflict into greater intimacy? I think for me, the three keys are: one, trigger awareness. Awareness in general of self is a big part of any kind of conflict resolution or transformation. For me, I legitimately feel like conflict in some ways is a spiritual path, right? If spirituality is about becoming more self-aware, conflict, I think, is one of the greatest opportunities for us to become self-aware. It's often in that sort of crucible of conflict that we learn incredible things about ourselves and other relationships that we're in that might not happen any other way. And so I want people to have tools to be able to navigate them in ways that actually enhances and strengthens that intimacy instead of weakens or undermines it. So trigger awareness, I'll say a little bit more, but this is essentially, what is your response to being triggered? What does that look like? How do you become a master of your own process as an individual? What are the communication tools for navigating when you are triggered, right? How do you sort of move your way through the choppy waters of conflict, especially when you yourself are feeling agitated or provoked? And then, as I said, sort of that first pillar of one of the takeaways from restorative justice is having a clear process, having a structure in which your conversation happens. The more intentionality that you bring to conflict, the less sort of likely you are to escalate or devolve into something that is potentially regrettable. Let's look at kind of a brief overview of the anatomy of conflict. I've recognized that there's sort of two levels, right? One is the storm. What is the storm? This is, first you're triggered, something happens. Someone says something that you don't like, does something, you get activated. What's your capacity to stay auto-regulated, right? Your own emotional response to that. Can you stay within yourself? Do you sort of get out of control? Then what happens to your communication, right? Do you start to attack or defend or disappear and shrink? You go into shame or blame. right? This is a really important part of any conflict, but we have to be able to sort of make our way through a trigger in a way that's skilled and conscious in order to get to the level of content. Unfortunately, 90% of what I see people having trouble with is making it through the storm into content. Content is really where acknowledgement happens, right? You can't get to acknowledgement if you've got one or two people or more who are not regulated emotionally, who are still in their trigger and can't sort of communicate from a place of conscious intention. Again, I'm not dismissing the difficulty of doing so, but it is important to be able to get to that place in order to get to the skills and place within yourself where you can actually offer an acknowledgement. With acknowledgements, their needs and wants, and these are really the, I think, core of conflicts, is when we sort of have differing needs or differing wants. Unfortunately, we don't start there with a kind of a negotiated conversation around what are the needs and wants here. Instead, we're often sort of, oh, I'm not going to get what I need out of this conversation, this interaction. We start to get triggered, fear comes up, and we kind of go off to the races and we get lost in the storm. Ideally, what we want to be able to do is get quicker and quicker to getting to the needs and wants. And then finally, agreements, right? What are the things we want to walk away with so that it feels like there is transformation, that there is change, not just we're going to go back into sort of a cyclical recapitulation of what has already been. So reflecting on our own process, where do we tend to get stuck? Do you tend to get stuck in the storm? There's no shame in that. You know, these are not things that we typically learn in general, unfortunately. That's why a big part of why I do this work is I want people to have the skills that help them navigate the storm more successfully to get to the content. So let's look at some of that, the trigger awareness piece. What are your triggers? Number one, what triggers you? Tones of voice, situations, gestures? Now, what is it specifically? Sometimes some triggers are more provocative than others. Sometimes one person in your life could do the same exact action or say the exact thing that doesn't trigger you and someone else does for some reason. Knowing what your triggers are and where they're apt to emerge in interactions is huge. What are your internal experiences, i.e. somatic experiences, right? Physical sensations. Do you tend to get tightness in the chest? Do your shoulders go up? Do you stop breathing? Right? Knowing and being aware of what your body doing, how your somatic response is in response to a particular trigger can actually start to take your fight or flight energy from the amygdala, sort of interrupt that hijacking that happens, right, of your higher brain functions. As you go down to the amygdala, you go lower and lower into the primal brain, you start to lose the capacity to stay conscious of what's happening. You lose the executive functions of the neocortex. Doing a body scan can be one quick way to start to bring yourself back up, Jacob's ladder, so to speak, into the sort of the higher brain functions that can let you respond to situations more skillfully. Another awareness piece is, what are your emotions? What are the emotions? Sadness, anger, rage, depression, fear that get triggered by a particular trigger. And then what are the thoughts and stories? Right? I'll never be loved, I'll never be lovable, or this relationship has no future, or they don't respect me, right? What are the stories that come online when you get into a triggered state that start to take over your perception and start to create a filter through which you can only see problems? And then finally, what are your external reactions? How do you typically respond to conflict? You know, do you yell? Do you shrink? Do you disappear? Do you make it worse by sort of attacking, raising your voice? We all have different ways of responding. Most of us aren't aware of all of these different ways that sort of our triggers manifest in us. With this trigger awareness, we can interrupt the trigger cycle, right? You become triggered, there's an impulse. Through that awareness, hopefully we can create a choice point where then we enact different behavior, right? That allows us to, instead of escalating conflict, de-escalate it and come into more of a resource place from which we can continue the conversation. Trigger awareness is a sort of something that gives way to communication tools in particular, right? One would be naming your experience. Often this is just making your trigger reactions explicit. Wow, I'm feeling really triggered. Sometimes that alone can be a really powerful way to disrupt A trigger spiral. I'm feeling really triggered. Even if you don't know why, you're not fully conscious of it. Just naming that you're triggered can start to create space between it and you. Making I statements, taking full responsibility for your experience. This is what I'm experiencing. Again, it's sort of an extension of that trigger awareness we were just naming. I'm feeling a lot of tightness in my chest. I'm feeling uncomfortable. I'm having a hard time with what you're saying, right? Positioning your perspective, your observations and your own lived experience instead of starting to make it the other person's fault or responsibility. A lot of these principles are coming from schools of thought like nonviolent communication, getting to needs and wants, being able to name those. As I mentioned earlier, this is really at the sort of root of what many conflicts are about. If we can learn to be clear about what we're needing and wanting in moments of conflict, it can start to help bypass some of the buildup or the escalation that happens in that storm phase. And then finally, this is an underutilized tool, stepping away if needed. If you can't get your sort of trigger under control, if you can't re-regulate yourself emotionally, it's super valid and sometimes really the most strategically smart thing to do is to step away. The trick is to do it in a way that's acknowledging that you're doing it, to name it. I need to step away. I want to honor this process. I see what you're saying is really important. I just can't hold space for it in a way that feels resourced or safe. I need to go get regulated and then I'll come back and we can have this process when we're both in a different space. A lot of people have a hard time disengaging. A lot of times the sort of attachment mechanisms that can start to get activated when we are in a triggered state really keep us locked into a confrontation, and it doesn't feel safe or sort of proper or polite to disengage. And yet often if it's done in a way that's skillful and named, it can actually be one of the best strategies for sort of avoiding regrettable situations. Finally, like I said before, with restorative justice, one of the big takeaways is having a clear process. This is something that one of the most practical elements that I offer clients is I give them a container in which they can have their difficult conversations. The first part is assigning roles. What do the roles look like? Speaker and listener, very simple in that sense. Each person takes turns. They get a chance to be speaker and listener. I'll say more about what each of these components entails in just a moment. Reflecting back what you've heard. So the listener is going to repeat back only what they've heard the speaker say. This is a very important skill to have. Acknowledging the hurt. Again, this is another job of the listener, right? Acknowledging that their actions or statements have had an impact on the other person. And then again, making the agreements. So if we unpack these things and we assign the roles, this is an important thing to do. By having clearly defined roles for each participant during the process, we know what to expect and can thereby lean into the structure of the process for increased emotional safety. It's often good to set aside time to have a difficult conversation and then decide who's going to be speaker first and listener first. By doing that, knowing who's going first can sort of create this structure through which you can lean in and find more safety. You know what's going to happen. The more predictability in the face of a possibly triggering or challenging conversation, the better. So speaker and listener, what does that really look like? So as listener, we're not going to respond or interrupt. The only time you would do that is if you didn't understand the statement, just for clarification's sake, and then you would go back into the pure listening mode. This has to be strictly upheld. This is sometimes challenging for partners, especially when they feel like something that's being shared by the speaker is triggering. This is where it is important to have a facilitator there present to maintain some of these guidelines. Give full attention and stay open and stay curious. Don't just sit there sort of waiting for your rebuttal. You really want to open a genuine space of listening. What is this person saying to me? How do I hold space for that in a way that's really honors their experience instead of just waiting for my chance to superimpose my own onto it? Reflect back only what you hear. We'll dive even further into this in just a moment, but this is really key. And then acknowledge the impact of our behavior. For the speaker, we speak from our own experience, right? What happened to you? What was your experience of it? What was the impact on you personally? You want to take full ownership of your experience. It's okay to have strong emotions. It's okay to be intense. And this is another thing that not everyone is comfortable doing, is creating space for other people to get big, emotional, or intense. As long as someone's clean in their delivery, we need to give them the space to have their emotions. Sometimes people, just in the face of intensity, take that to mean that some rule of conflict resolution is being broken, but it's not the intensity itself. Now, this is where trauma becomes important, and trauma-informed care, because some people who have grown up in households where there was abuse, whether physical or psychological, we do have to create certain parameters around intensity and the way that that gets expressed in interpersonal relationship conflict. So I don't want to gloss over that potential either. We never want to name another's intentions. This is particularly problematic, especially with partners, right? You don't care about me. You never meant to do this or that. Like, sort of taking our hurt and transforming it into a projection about what the other person, assumption about what the other person's intention is very, very problematic. And then finally, we seek to inform. This is really about letting the other person know what the impact of their behavior was on us. It's not to attack or blame them or make them responsible for our own inner experience. Taking turns is fairly self-explanatory. Again, that's just both people getting the chance to be speaker and listener. Reflecting back. So for many of us, having someone accurately reflect back to us what we have shared is one of the most important steps to transforming conflict. Knowing we have really been heard without having to deflect or manage justifications, dismissals, explanations, or solutioning of our experience is extremely powerful and validating.
David, Shireen has her hand up.
Shireen.
Thank you, Layla and David. So back to the taking turns and the speaker role and the listener role. I think someplace where I see it being really challenging, even for a committed and dedicated listener, is when the speaker is doing kind of a dump, or what's called flooding. Like, they talk about so many different things that the listener will practically have to start taking notes on everything they brought up so that they can do an accurate reflection. So I wonder if there is a rule in your method about sort of chunking, and because I think without it, it's just going to be really hard.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic question. I'm glad you're highlighting that. That was something that I was going to get to when I started to sort of unpack kind of what things look like once a client makes contact, and kind of how we start to work together. But to address it in the moment is really when we start to get into a restorative relationship conversation, we're going to get specific, and we agree ahead of time before we actually have the process itself. What are we talking about? So we really zero in, and it's a unanimous decision before we start, right? We are going to be talking about X, maybe X and Y, but not more than that, right? So a big part of that is creating these digestible amounts of content. And then being really explicit, like, this is all we're talking about. So we're not bringing in the past things like this thing, but what about this and that? So we really want to keep things in their place in a way that allows them to be just, yeah, like I said, digestible, manageable, and not overwhelming. So I appreciate that question. Yeah. So the reflecting back, this is interesting for me. I see a lot of people have a hard time doing it. The urge to, after hearing someone talk about ways that we've impacted them, is to really say something back, go right into an apology, explain why what happened, explain what was going on for us, or what it makes us even think of. And these are all subtle ways of really disempowering the speaker. It's a really subtle way, and sometimes not so subtle way, of robbing them of the opportunity to really have their experience seen. And so reflecting back makes them recognize that you know what they said, right? You're acknowledging, yes, I've heard what you said. You said that when I did X, Y, and Z, it made you feel this way and that way. Having that just cleanly shared back really just lets that person sort of rest into, okay, I've been seen, you get it. right? If we go right into something else, that question mark is there. Did they really hear me? Did I get heard? And it can sort of perpetuate the conflict energy that's there between people. On a similar note, there's a similar importance for creating the space for each participant to share their experience and be genuinely heard, and to have acknowledgement offered, right, to anyone that's been impacted by a particular situation. When ruptures in relationships happen, the primary means of restoring the connection is through empathy and understanding. So acknowledgement is really the key to communicating these intentions. I think that's why it's so fundamental to our experience when we find ourselves in interpersonal conflict. We need to have it acknowledged for us to let go of the tension that we hold around it. Sometimes it's not the only thing we need, and sometimes it's not the only sort of solution, but it's most often the moment in which things start to turn in an interpersonal conflict is when genuine acknowledgement has happened. A caveat about acknowledgement is that some people feel resistance to reflecting back other people's experiences or offering acknowledgement before explaining themselves and their position. And they mistakenly confuse acknowledgement with an admission of guilt or being in the wrong. But we've got to see that recognizing another's experience does not invalidate our own. Part of where this comes from is sort of what I was talking about earlier when we talked about the difference between the classic criminal justice system and restorative justice approach, right? Because we live under the threat of liabilities, crushing economic sanctions or just being sued, right? A lot of us have internalized a punitive paradigm or sort of an adversarial paradigm that we take into our interpersonal conflicts. It's interesting how we internalize our society's approach to conflict and then recapitulate that in the context of our interpersonal relationships instead of a more collaborative or restorative approach. And so we have to often in these restorative processes, we have to make people feel safe to make an acknowledgement and really emphasize the fact that because you're acknowledging that your behavior has impacted someone else doesn't negate your own experience. And it doesn't mean you're accepting some kind of moral infraction. And so it's really important that be explicit, because for a lot of people, it can be an unconscious obstacle. So finally, there's making agreements, right? In terms of the process itself. Repairing the trust in the relationship can be achieved by making agreements to do things differently. And together, participants come up with specific agreements about how things need to be different in order to move forward with the relationship. So that's not something that I would do for participants. I can come up with suggestions, make offerings, but I'll never tell people what they should do for themselves. This always has to be something that participants generate and agree on in a way that feels unanimous. So one of the things that I learned in doing restorative justice, I had to work a lot with the law enforcement agency of the city in which I was working. And working with law officers there's a different kind of culture there. And it taught me a lot. And one of their mottos, which I really liked and bring into the process of processing or dealing with conflict, is proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. Being prepared for conflict can really be one of the most important ways to handle and deal with it. What does that mean? One way is by asking everyone for a time to talk about a specific issue, right? Avoid emotional drive-bys and reckless lip flapping. What does that mean? Your partner's on the way out and you start mentioning or opening up a topic of discussion that can't possibly be dealt with in that moment, right? And so it's sort of, you're throwing an emotional grenade as someone's walking out of the space so that they then take that with them. Also, it can happen that, especially with intimate relationships, where if you're living with someone or spending a lot of time with someone, we sort of start to take them for granted in some ways. And we just feel like we have the right to just start going into emotional process with them. And just start kind of, the word I think you used earlier, Sharon, was dumping, emotional dumping. Like, why do we have that right to do that to anybody, even a partner? And so making a time is a really good strategy. Making sure that everyone's prepared and on the same page about having a conversation that's potentially challenging is really a good strategy. Urgency is not your friend. It's good to slow things down. Obviously, when you get triggered, we tend to sort of ramp up. things start to speed up. We lose control. Part of the trick of this work is how to ease back, slow down, come back into your body. Use the somatic awareness tools that I mentioned earlier, becoming aware of how things are starting to manifest in your physical, your emotional and mental world. And then get consent. I like the Me Too movement and other movements that really are putting consent at the center of their value system. I think it's the same thing with conflict. Get consent to enter into a potentially challenging conversation. Don't just start going into it. Ask people if people are ready for it. That was one of the things that I was going to say when I start working with clients. There's a protocol that I follow. People reach out to me. We set up an initial appointment. That initial appointment gives me a chance to get to know them. I discuss the protocol from A to Z, what they can expect in terms of steps, what my expectations are, what the ground rules are. They agree to those. Then I hear their story. Then we agree on what we're going to be talking about. Then we have a separate session. That was something that I learned in the context of restorative justice. You never just throw someone into a process until you train them. You literally train every participant by having this staggered approach for the actual restorative process. And that was one of the ways that really helped not guarantee, but just sort of ensure that there was going to be a safer process for everyone involved. So this intentionality, slowing it down, establishing consent is something that I really want to just convey and sort of make part of the new culture around how to transform conflict, how to think about it and how to approach it. So where do we go from here? We've all sort of familiar with how we respond to conflict now. What about something new, right? I think the restorative relationship conversation model is something new. I think it's something interesting and dynamic, and it gets a lot of great results with people. So I appreciate you all for taking the time to hear my presentation, engage with this model, and yeah, I'd love to open it up now for a discussion here. Feedback, thoughts, questions, whatever you got.
Thank you, David. It's really impressive. Our work overlaps with yours, and I took a lot of notes about how we can make our work better based on your presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So we have everybody, I think we have 15 minutes for Q&A. Is that right, Leila?
We have quite a bit more time than that, really. We have till 1:30 is when we
Okay, perfect. So yeah,
we need to, but
so take your time and ask your questions. I see Sarah.
Hi, that was really great. I'm very impressed by how well you break things down that are really complicated into very simple terms. So thank you for that. As I mentioned in the chat, I've had my skepticism around restorative justice, in part because it tends to be the aggressor-centered rather than victim-centered. And I was really intrigued by what you were just talking about with regard to establishing consent. So, because it sounds like you're in a process where two people have already agreed to be involved in this and have come to you specifically for that, rather than a process being enforced on them. And then maybe somebody who has been harmed feeling like they're sort of forced to be in this process with their harm, the responsible person, to use the language that you recommended. So is that correct in terms of your approach?
Absolutely. I think that's a really prescient observation. It's one of the reasons why I also transitioned out of restorative justice. Like I said before, restorative practices are typically operating at the level of the institution. And so in some ways, I felt my hands tied. There were modalities that I wanted to incorporate into the process of working with people on a restorative process that didn't fit in that context. And there was one experience in particular that really changed my thinking about what I was doing, and it does tie into what you said. And it was when an elementary school, local elementary school, had a really significant fight between one 8-year-old girl and 3, 7, 6, and kind of 9-year-old boys. The cops were called. Everyone was too young to be arrested, but it was a severe rupture in this very small community-based school. And the principal was at a loss. These families didn't want to return to school until something had been done. And so typically the majority of our referrals came from, as I said before, law enforcement. And so people were sort of leveraged into the restorative process. Again, you sort of have to, you're offering someone who's being given that choice, sort of, you either go to court or you do restorative justice. Restorative justice sounds a lot better. I don't really want to be here, but I'm here, let's make it work. Often those people then do have very transformative experiences in the context of circles. And that's one of the really cool things to see, is someone who is sort of initially reticent or resistant, then have a very powerful transformed experience in the context of something they didn't want initially. But again, you do have to get to that point. What was different about this school incident is that everyone wanted this. We weren't getting paid to do this. There was no legal ramifications. No one was being forced to participate or even leveraged to participate in this restorative circle at this elementary school. And so we were there on a day off, me and another colleague who were really passionate about creating this experience for these young people and their families. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like that. Just people in tears, people seeing each other for the first time, just making repair that was just really exciting. And I left that with a sensation of, I want to be working with people that want to be in this space. And so when I started creating the restorative relationship conversation model, I made that explicit, and do make that explicit, that I don't want to work with anyone that's being coerced or dragged. If one partner's dragging another partner, I won't do it. People have to have buy-in, and it's huge. And so that means it's not for everybody. And I'm very explicit about that and comfortable with that limitation, because it means that the work then really does what it's supposed to do. Great question. Thank you so much. Any others?
I can ask another one if people are. You used the word trigger earlier, and a lot of people associate that with trauma, but the way that you were using it sounds like a more general approach, like being activated. Is that similar to your intention with that?
Absolutely. Anytime you feel agitated, your nervous system feels activated, if you feel yourself slipping to any degree into fight or flight in the face of a potential conflict, right? That's one of the most interesting things to me about this process, is none of us, for the most part, unless you've taken training and sought that training out, has learned how to stay relaxed in the face of conflict. Like something triggers you, how aware are you of it? Do you know when you're at a 1, 2, or 3? Are you able to communicate that to the person that you're interfacing with? Or do you just erupt at a 7, 8, or 9, or 10? Most people don't realize that they're on this sort of escalating trajectory up through their nervous system's trigger response. And they only know what to do at 8, 9, or 10, and it's usually not helpful. And so really teaching people how to get to the subtle awareness piece. Like a lot of my work with clients is just like, how do you be aware of yourself at so many different places? Like this work is really about mindfulness in so many ways. So triggers for me can be anything, any agitation of your nervous system that starts to dysregulate you emotionally. Great question. Looks like Jared, I saw Jared's hand up.
Yes, hi everybody. Just a quick question. I'm learning so much from this conversation from everyone who is participating in the chat and also speaking. So thank you all so much. One thing that I think really hit me as a former educator in an alternative school, it was a very different experience than what you had just addressed, David, in the sense that all of these students were being reprimanded for behaviors in their regular classrooms and then sent to, an alternative school with a quote unquote restorative framework in place. but all of these restorative circle conversations were all forced on the students. So they actually, in order to earn their way back into the regular high school classroom, they had to participate in the circles, at least be present, you know. And so I can definitely see how the lack of buy-in or the lack of consent can be harmful and can undermine the process for everyone else who maybe has good intentions and wants to participate. So that was a huge takeaway for me. But I have a question as it relates to the numbers of how many people can be involved in the process with, you know, or I don't know, you talk about how each of the parties involved have to give consent. But when is it kind of undermining the process when there are too many folks involved, too many people who are being harmed or who are the harmer? Do you have any thoughts based on your experience or maybe anyone else in the virtual room? Thank you all.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate that observation. I want to speak to the first observation about sort of what do you do about undermining the restorative process through coercion, right? Sort of a top-down approach. The organization I work for in Colorado really worked hard to vet schools that were wanting to incorporate restorative justice, some kind of restorative process rather for the school context. And so it really depended on the administration, and what we sort of sussed out was their intentions or their way of wanting to use it. And we did have to say no to certain institutions. If it felt like sort of the people at the top of the administrators really understood the spirit of what it was for and were integrating it into a way that was more offering it as opposed to imposing it, then we would sort of go ahead with that relationship. Because we were a nonprofit and a third-party entity, we had more freedom to sort of protect the integrity of our process, where a lot of, unfortunately, restorative justice programs are tied to other entities, right? Like a district attorney's office. They don't have the same luxuries that we had as a third-party entity. So that's one consideration. So it really just depends. Right now, I think because the field is still so emergent, there's not a standard of practices across the board. Like every state, every organization is really doing it in different ways. And so it's tricky. It's tricky to deal with. Whereas for me, what I'm doing is so personal. I have total control over kind of who steps into the process or not. In terms of how many people, yeah, that situation that I just mentioned, that was a restorative justice process, but we had up to 15 participants in that circle. I've done up to 20, I think, is my largest circle. I had 2 facilitators and then 2 community members who were supporting us. And it was done really well. And a lot of that is with strategy. Again, the preparation. You really have to prep. The bigger the circle, the more you have to prep for it. And you have to get really specific about what is the content, what are we addressing, how long are people going to get to speak. It's kind of, you have to orchestrate it, but it can be done. I like to work with smaller groups. So in terms of the restorative relationship conversation model, the largest I'll do is 6, depending on the situation, maybe 7. But that ends up being a pretty long process and usually has to be broken up into multiple processes. But thank you for that, Jared. I see Enrique's hand.
Yes, I had a question for you. Like I said, for me, all of this is a learning experience, and gaining any new skills on how to act instead of react is always helpful. So recently I started reading a book on emotional intelligence, and I wanted to get your view regarding the emotional intelligence with conflict resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fundamental part. I think there's kind of a paradigm shift that needs to happen to change the culture around how we deal with conflict. And a big part of that is, you know, what can we do as individuals? Like, how can we change the way we see and experience conflict? And a big part of that is how do we equip ourselves to do that, right? So I think emotional intelligence is really the cornerstone of being able to navigate conflict successfully. And when I say successfully, I mean turn it into more intimacy and connection, as opposed to being something that's destructive or hurtful or creating ruptures. So again, any level of awareness is going to serve you, right? Because emotional intelligence has everything to do with the trigger awareness that I mentioned before, right? That's essentially it's actually a deepening of that skill set. In some ways, trigger awareness, like emotional, let me back up. Emotional intelligence is really just sort of one of those subgroups in the trigger awareness, right? I mean, it's more expansive than that, but it's sort of a piece that fits in our own awareness when it comes to triggers. And so I like the model that I've incorporated around trigger management because it's deepening our own self-awareness. Like we're not just looking at an emotional piece, but a physiological piece, seeing the connection between those, and then also the stories, what's the intellectual piece, right? What are the ideas, the thoughts that start spinning when you are having a certain emotion and that's linked to a physical sensation? All that experience creates kind of a gestalt or a totality of disruption or dysregulation. If you can catch any one of those pieces, that can be your tool back to a regulated state, back to a grounded place where you can start having a different kind of conversation. So much of what sets each other off, how we set each other off, is we're dysregulated, right? Other people can feel that. We have the neurons, the mirror neurons firing. Someone's agitated. I start to feel that. If I lose control of myself, we're lost in the storm together. So it was really through hundreds and hundreds of hours of doing the restorative justice, sitting in a room filled with tension over and over and over again, that my nervous system started to reconfigure its relationship to tension, other people's tension, and start to create new ways to just be in that and stay relaxed. So it was really a master education, kind of like a PhD work for me, and recalibrating my nervous system in response to other people's tension. Sort of, excuse me for the long-windedness of that answer.
No, thank you. That was very helpful.
Awesome.
Go ahead, Shireen.
So I'm glad both Enrique and David, you both talked about emotional intelligence as something that we learn. Enrique, you said you're reading a book, and your experiences can then support what we are learning, because in the kind of work that I do as a psychology person and the work we do with Conflict Transformation Academy, one of the misnomers about emotional intelligence that can actually harm people is that people say, I'm very emotionally intelligent. I can tell what other people are feeling. And that can get us in, that can actually help escalate conflict, because as you were saying, in reflective listening, we're not telling people how they feel. We are just reflecting back what they said, not how we interpret what they said as indicating an emotion or something. So I appreciate the focus on learning emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. It's absolutely something that's learned and has to be trained. It's definitely not a default response, unfortunately, for most of us. And I think it's really important what you're saying too there about, just how do we integrate that in a way that's really integral? Because I've seen NVC be weaponized. Like, you can weaponize any system, right, if it's not used in a way. And so part of what's really important is recognizing that we don't have the right to speak for other people. What we're trying to do is create space for someone else's experience to emerge, right? In the same way we want our own lived experience to be held and seen and responded to at its own face value, we need to do that for other people. And so whenever I hear people speaking for someone else, it's an immediate red flag. And that's where I have to really jump in as a facilitator and stop and redirect and, like, okay, how do you make that a self-statement? How do you take ownership of your experience? Like, it's very different for you to say, you're late, you don't care about me, you never show up on time, to it really, I feel disrespected and I feel uncared for when you're late. Mm-hmm. Right? Your experience, that person's action, but it's your experience. And there's a subtle distinction there, and it takes a lot of integrity to do that until you learn it and integrate it into your way of speaking.
I mean, after Sarah's question, I wanted to acknowledge that there are a couple of questions written in chat from people who are having who are not able to share
Thank you for acknowledging that.
verbally.
I haven't
Go,
been
go
tracking
ahead
those.
and answer those first. I'll just lower my hand.
Okay.
It was Ruth really that asked a question. The others are kind of comments, but are you able to see that, David?
Do you mind reading that out loud for me, Layla?
Sure, no problem. It says, I'm having tech troubles, so I can't ask on video, sorry. I spend a lot of time trying to teach this idea that conflict is an opportunity rather than a threat. It's so, so important. It is also a big lift for so many people. I think that for many, this reframe feels like a threat to what they think they know about how to keep themselves safe. I'd be curious to hear more about how you help people make that mental shift.
Absolutely. And so it's, again, I think I said this earlier, it's easy to say. It's very easy to say, right? Let's make this big paradigm shift. What does it really feel like experientially in our nervous systems? Again, down to a lived, embodied experience. There's a big sort of trench between those things. And so I don't want to be flippant or dismissive or casual about that, how big of an order that is. And yet that's where I think we need to go. And that's why I say and share that it's been hundreds of hours of me sitting in circles, like the training. And that, I don't think it has to be that. I think that was just sort of the symptom or the consequence of this path that I had chose. And after reflecting on it, looking back, I was like, oh, wow, that really gave me something that I didn't realize I was developing. So I'm curious, like, what is the potential for us to learn how to start sitting with conflict and engaging it differently? Like, how do we start to just the thought experiment alone, when I invite, let's say, a partnership where there's high conflict, where it's really hard for them to sit down and be in the same space together. And just even the thought of conflict can be scary to them. Like, just inviting them into the thought experiment of, what if it's not a problem? I know it's scary and intense, but what if it isn't a problem? What if it's uncomfortable, but what if we can actually find a way to sit in it together and explore it together as much as you're ready for? And that's where the trauma-informed piece of this work is really important. I never want to push people into a level of process that they're not ready for. And I'll gauge that. I'm constantly gauging that. And I'm constantly using consent. I'm asking couples or clients, like, are you ready for that? Is that okay? How does that feel? Do you still feel safe? I do a lot of checking in. So the trauma-informed approach really informs this piece in particular, right? Is, what are people ready to engage? What are their nervous systems ready to deal with and open up to? I've dealt with people who have extreme histories of abuse, and it's changed the way that I work with them. But it's still possible to do. And I've seen really remarkable changes. It just means I have to be more intentional in that process. Let me know if that feels like it's answered the question. I don't want to sidestep any questions. It's a really good question.
There was one other question actually in the chat as well. It's from Esteban, and he asks, is restorative justice still an option after an arrest or citation?
I'm trying to think of cases. Yeah, that's an issue that depends on the particular department. So for example, I was working in Longmont, Colorado, and the organization that I was working for had a really long history, 25 years of existence, which is one of the longest programs that I'm aware of in the country of the United States. And it had a really intimate relationship with the police department, because that police chief had a lot of buy-in. He really saw the magic of it. And so he really built it in from top down into the framework of how his police force operated in that city. Whereas in the neighboring town of Boulder, restorative justice was housed under the district attorney's office. And so all of the restorative processes in that context all happened. They were all post-arrest. And so one of the things that was really revolutionary about our offering was that it was pre-arrest. And so individuals didn't have to go through that process. And it was a referral that sidestepped that. And that was kind of going back to Sarah's point, that was sort of the leverage. Like, if people didn't go through our process, then they'd be referred back to the cops, who would then get processed however that was going to happen. But I think the fact that we had a pre-arrest program was actually novel in the realm of restorative justice as I've known it. I've been out of that game for a few years now, so things may have changed and there may be more of that pre-arrest opportunity. But that's a fantastic question.
We have a couple more hands and one more question in the chat, but I'll leave it to you to decide what order you want to take those in.
All right, Sarah, you've been so patient. I'm going to pass it back to you and then we'll go back to the chat.
The thing is, I could talk about this all day, so I don't want to take up too much airtime, but I kind of wanted to bounce off. I think it was Jared that was asking about how many people can be involved in the process. And, you know, even when we're talking about intimate relationships, if harm has been caused, sometimes it can have like a huge ripple effect on the whole community, and hundreds of people can actually be secondarily impacted by this. And then it becomes a lot bigger than just a conversation between two people with a mediator, but all of a sudden it's everybody's trauma. And so I was wondering what your take is on those kinds of situations. Like, I've seen restorative justice processes, for example, with sex educators or with polyamorous, like, you know, key figures in the community that do like an open restorative justice where the whole community is kind of a part of it. But what is your take on those larger scale processes?
I think it requires a different container. One of my favorite examples of success stories or two actually, for the restorative process in larger communal traumas is in the dealing with the apartheid in South Africa, in creating space for people that were complicit in the apartheid and people who really suffered underneath it to share, you know, both sides. And so it was a different container, right? It had to be a different format. And it was more of like creating a stage for people to get up and talk about their process. And so it was less sort of individual based, like the individuals are telling their stories, but it's on a platform that's much bigger and suited to hold that kind of process. So the protocol, the structure has to change to meet the scale, but it was really effective. You know, it did a lot of healing in communities that were really traumatized in some just profound ways. And it also happened in Rwanda. There were some restorative situations created in the aftermath of the genocide that were pretty successful. And so again, it was just a way in which you have to change the protocol, but it can be scaled up. It's just such a different, you just have to have a different mindset and approach to that level. And that's something that I'm less interested in, just because it starts to lose that I'm more comfortable in a very personal and directly engaged way. But the people that are suited for it, from my understanding, have had pretty remarkable results. One of the cool things about that, I'll just say this, one of the cool things about this model is it comes from indigenous practices, right? Not only from native tribes in the United States, but also from the peoples of New Zealand and Australia. And one of the things I really love about it is it's the idea that no one is expendable, right? This is kind of the problem with the idea of traditional criminal justice, is that you can just take someone out of the community and there's no impact. You have disposable humans. Whereas when you sort of shrink this down to a community level, it's like communities of old, no one's disposable. You had to find a way to reach resolution and reintegration. And I think that's why these processes are so humanizing, is because they recognize the value of every individual, and that every individual is intertwined to some community somewhere. And that hurt and harm and ruptures ripple out in ways that I think right now we don't have a really good intellectual understanding of. And so I love that consciousness that can hold that communal sort of impact of collective trauma and conflict.
Okay, did you want to go back to the chat, or did you want to take Shireen's question?
Let's go to the chat.
Okay, the next question in the chat was, what kind of training have you done to be able to have trauma-informed conversations?
That's a great question. So there's several trainings that I've gone through. One was given through the organization that I keep referencing. We had to go through a training where we learned how to work with victims of crime, ways to approach that, ways to hold space for that. And the organization I was working for really wanted to make sure that it was a genuinely victim-centered process. Again, I'm using that old nomenclature. So harm party centered process. I think it was you, Sarah, that made that comment earlier. It was like sometimes it can feel like restorative processes sort of fall into the trap of being responsible person led. And so it takes sort of an extra level of awareness and care to make sure that a restorative process stays grounded in a harmed party centered lens. And so dealing with trauma explicitly was a big part of the training that we all had to go through. On top of that, there's been several modalities that I've taken on my own, like internal family systems, working with inner parts. That's been one of the single most important practices that I've incorporated into my work. And when I feel that trauma is starting to emerge in the conversation with people, I'll stop, zero in on it, create space for it, and we'll start working with it. And it's really profound and really beautiful when other partners get to see them work through this stuff that's been there for the years and potentially at the root of their conflict for so long. It just has a lot of impact that's really beautiful and profound. Narrative therapy is something that I've studied and trained in, which I love. That really focuses, it's about decentering the professional as expert and making clients the real experts in their experience. And so that recentering or that reframing has been really important for me. That's especially important with people who have trauma, making sure that they're staying at the center of their experience, describing their experience. I'm using their language to mirror back what I'm hearing them say to me. Like everything I'm guiding through people, the process I'm guiding through people, I'm also doing myself. So I'm reflecting back. I'm using a client-led approach, which comes from sort of a trauma-centered point of reference as well. I'm trying to think of other specifically trauma-centered trainings. Those are the two big ones, though, was through the Restorative Justice Organization and the IFS training.
The only other question in the chat was, is active listening a big part of what you teach your clients?
I'll take it a step further. If you look into mindful listening, I think it takes another level of depth. Active listening for sure is a huge part and is really what I'm inviting the listener to do when we're in that restorative process. But mindful listening takes it even a step further, where you're really invited to observe, what are your thoughts? What are the stories? What are your process? Are you having resistance to even holding space for the other person? Is that something you need to pay attention to? Maybe there's some part of you that's protecting you from opening up to acknowledgement or being in this restorative process. That's important to listen to and pay attention to. So mindful listening just sort of broadens the skill set and intentionality that we want to bring to any kind of restorative process. But I think it's a key skill for sure. And Sharon?
Yeah, so my sense is that a lot of the people who are interested in this conversation will not have access to a third party like you to help them mediate their conflicts that they are experiencing in their intimate relationships. So, and I understand the model really has that mediator, not, that kind of mediation, but a third person. Do you have any suggestions for any parts of this that people who are interested in that but don't have access can incorporate into their own conversations, difficult conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Like any of the skill sets that I've been talking about can be kind of learned ad hoc. You can kind of a la carte this stuff, right? Any work on any of these dimensions is going to benefit your interpersonal world. Just as Enrique said, it's like if you develop emotional intelligence, you're doing yourself and all of your relationships a favor, right? Same thing with trigger awareness, like looking up, like I'm not the originator of trigger awareness. That's just something I've incorporated into my work because I see it as so fundamental. But if you start to become aware of your own triggers, really become an observer, a master sort of mindfulness practitioner around your own internal processes, that's huge. NVC is great, like learning nonviolent communication is great. to be honest, I wish this process was more, I mean, this is sort of why I'm here talking, is I want to broadcast that this is what I do. I exist. Here's a model. I want to share it. I don't have any, special sauce that I'm keeping secret that no one's going to get my recipe. Like, I want this to be known. It does take time to learn, but it can be done. So even just learning things like slowing down, getting consent, like these little kind of concepts that I'm throwing out are big for people when they start to actually incorporate them into their own process. Like, how many people stop and invite someone into a hard conversation instead of just going into it, right? That alone can be a lot for people. Or just thinking about, yeah, what are my obstacles to holding space and acknowledging or reflecting back what someone's telling me when they approach me with something they don't like, right? So, I'd like to say I had this kind of edifice of things to send people to. That's sort of like the next phase as I evolve and grow and have the space and time to develop those materials. But for now, it's really just, it's word of mouth. It's kind of just getting it out there and sharing my experiences and my work with people as much as I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so cool you're doing what you're doing. I mean, just organizations like you are really inspiring, because I see you as part of that culture building. So I'm really grateful to you all. And
That's our goal, is to change the culture at ACC more toward conflict transformation. It's a tiny little goal, but
powerful. Awesome. Yeah.
Well, people who want to review some of these concepts that you talked about, some of these principles, will have the video posted so they can review it and take notes, parts that appeal to them, they think they can find useful.
Perfect. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me at david@restorativerelationship.com. I love getting inquiry. I love building community. I love meeting people. Even if you just have insights, observations, questions, I'm happy to receive those things. So I'd like to sort of dismantle the obstacles to people getting resources and connections if they want them. And then also, my understanding is that sort of in a few months down the road, we're going to do a workshop where I'm going to demonstrate one of these sessions. Is that still, I don't know if I should keep that cat in the bag, or is that okay?
Yeah. Layla, did you already post the link to our upcoming events?
I did share a link to
Okay.
our event page, but we don't have the registration open for spring yet. We're kind of holding off on publishing our spring offerings until a little later, but there's no problem in mentioning it, David. We definitely intend to bring you back, and it'll probably happen in March, and we're very excited about it.
Yeah,
and I just typed David's email into the chat as well, for those of you who want to copy that down.
Thank you, Layla.
Thank you. And Layla, do you remember what's our next event in this series and when?
Well, I do. There may be a hiccup. I recently was corresponding with our next presenter, JP Cardenas, who is going to talk to us about the title he came up with is Fat Love and More, where he's going to be talking about body issues and how to love and be loved as a fat person. That's supposed to be on the 25th, but we may have to adjust that date. So
okay. Just keep checking our website.
Yeah, and we'll keep emailing you, and yeah.
And if you're interested in that event, go ahead and register for it, because if you're registered, we will notify you of if there's a change in the date. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone that was here.
Thank you, everyone.